And we are back with another episode of the Artisans of the Horizon. And this week we have my dear friend and wonderful human being in the whole world, Rivera Sun. Rivera, would you like to tell us a bit about you and your work and how you show up in the world?
Sure. Well, I think first, being your dear friend and the wonderful human being in the world is a pretty great bio, but I'm also a novelist and a nonviolence trainer, and I edit a weekly news service called Nonviolence News that collects 30 to 50 stories each week of how nonviolence is being used in action around the world. I live in New Mexico, and I am a pretty big enthusiast for all things change oriented. I'm really get excited about times of change.
That's so cool. I mean, I remember when we first met and we became friends. We were friends online for quite a while before we actually met in person. And we met in person at a rally, at a big demonstration in New Mexico, commemorating Hiroshima, the bombing of Hiroshima, with a bunch of people, thousands of people, for the Campaign on Violence National Conference, the first one that they did, that we were both a part of, and that was a really wonderful experience. And you and I both work in change making and different justice circles and art and everything. And so, part of this conversation series is about showcasing the minds of different change makers so that we can kind of get a more clear vision of what people what people have in their mind and in their hearts, which motivates them to do the work on the ground that they are doing. That makes them want to be available to this experience. And so to me, that, there's reasons why I do the things that I do, and there are reasons why other people do other things. So can you tell us a little bit about what does it mean for you to be an artisan of the horizon, somebody who is giving birth to a new normal?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we say is the horizon for us is actually long overdue, and is very normal to our sense of our human dignity, right? So you and I and everyone, we want to be treated as equals. We want to be treated with respect. We want to have fair opportunities in our world, and we've wanted these things for a very long time. No matter what our configuration as a human being is, many of us have been left out of that kind of a world, right? And we've said for a very long time that the system of privileging certain people over others really stinks, basically. And that we know another world is possible, and that we've been committed for centuries to working towards that world. So what we see on the horizon is really this eternal vision that's rooted in our humanity, our sense of self-worth and dignity, in many ways. And I do think there are elements of this vision that we have today that maybe we haven't been thinking about for thousands of years, but we're very excited to think about today. There are things that we've lost sight of along the way that we're just kind of relearning or rediscovering. I think for many of us, dispelling that sense of separation from the earth has been a very big learning curve, that has to do with when our cultures or subcultures got severed from that and why. There are long stories about that. But I think also in reclaiming all these aspects of our humanness, we also get to say, what do they look like in today's era? That, the last time people who looked like me had a direct living relationship, spiritual relationship with the earth was in pagan times in Europe. And today I am a descendant of colonists and settlers and immigrants to North America. The very frameworks of how I determine my relationship to place and land don't emerge in an ancestral sense of Europe, of Ireland, of England. They emerge in the context of being in this continent with its very complicated stories. So yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think the answers to it are both woven in dealing with the past and with our courage to dream of a future that is different than our present.
Yeah, and you said some really great points too that I think I resonate a lot with. I think really particularly for me, part of being an artisan, somebody that's painting a new picture, that's trying to reframe how we see the world, is about really deeply claiming our humanity. Um, Giving ourselves and giving our loved ones and those around us permission to be all that we are. Um, I tend to often say that I think we have everything that we need to be on inside of us. We have just actively been distracted so much that we don't know it. So we have to get in touch with it. And I think one of the ways that we do that, and you kind of alluded to some of this, is through stories. Um, Through dreaming, trying to dream up a new reality, trying to get in touch with the intuition that we have already about ourselves. I think all of us have an innate sense of worth, of knowing who we really are. That's why we get so dignified when people call us names or abuse us or harm us in some way. So dreaming up ways to kind of take that internal reality and make it an outward reality. Um, and also understanding that we're a part of a long story, a story that precedes us, that we are a part of now, and that we are shaping as we go forth. And I think one of the ways that we do that is through art, and through dance and through writing. And those are all things that you do. So, can you share with us, how do you feel as a novelist, you get to help shape the story that's to come with your writing? I mean, you have great novels, so, and if you have any examples, feel free to show.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the prerogatives and the privileges, actually, of novelists, and not all of whom use those opportunities, I would say, is to expand the envelope of possibilities, or to breathe life into a character that makes us remember things about ourselves, see something about ourselves, acknowledge some beautiful aspect that society doesn't acknowledge. That a book like this is a whole volume of space in which to breathe in the possibilities that society might have constrained out of permissibility or even existence in some cases. I love sci-fi. I love fantasy, particularly, I'm just going to name it, non-white, non-heteronormative, because
Mm-hmm.
it gets your mind out of the boxes that you don't even know you're living in.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We are living in this landscape of imagination that is really shaped and formed by our dominant culture. And until we start to question what is on the horizon of those boxes, we never actually look around the corner or look over the top and be like, wow, there's a whole world of possibilities out there. And that world might be incredibly beautiful, far more beautiful than what's stuck inside the box, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, getting to write stories is getting the imaginative, the social, and the cultural, and the artistic space to get to think about these possibilities and to get to breathe into the landscape of the world that we've dreamt of, where our humanness in all of its diverse and many, many forms gets to have its beauty and its presence expressed more fully on the stage of this earth than the ways that the culture that we have inherited or been born into in today's times often allows. And I do want to acknowledge that, in 2020, we live in a very different world than 1950,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's a very different world than 1890. And so I do want to acknowledge that many things have changed, even while we know how much has not changed and how much remains to be challenged and transformed. But to honor the work of those who came before us, that pushed open those envelopes that allow our very existence, that allow you and I to be having this conversation here today,
Mm-hmm.
right? That we come in a lineage, we come on the shoulders of of people who have pushed those envelopes in social movements, in arts, in their lives, in coming out of the closet, if you're
Mhm.
oriented as an LGBTQIA. And every single one of those letters has expanded the envelope for our human
Mhm.
existence to express in its truthful authenticity. Um, yeah, and then we continue the work. I've been telling many people about this book, A People's Future of the United States,
Mm.
which I am reading right now and am in awe of. It's written by a collection of 25 speculative fiction writers,
Mm.
some who are well known at this point, like N.K. Jemisin, and
Oh
others whom you
yeah.
may not have heard of. Um, but every single story send your mind in another direction of possibility of where this country called the United States might be going. And if your mind isn't blown by page 10, uh, well, you're probably already living into some of these stories, right? But for most of us, our minds are going to be like, "Whoa, I never thought of that." And that's what writing should always be doing for us. Always be opening our minds, not closing them down.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love your phrase about your novel of it's like a volume of spaciousness, of creating space. I think that's so cool. Yeah, I agree with you. I think writing and art in general really is intended to be a modality of expansion, a modality of horizon, of helping you to have a long view, a wide view of what is and what could be. And and yeah, I agree with you. I do think that we are part of many different lineages of great people who have done beautiful, um, dangerous, radical, provocative, upsetting work
Yeah.
that now we look upon and we're like, wow, why did people get so upset about that? you
Yeah.
know? And I really do. I'm a big believer that you cannot, you can harm a body and you can harm a spirit. But I think if you are able to instill into a people an ability to dream, an ability to cast themselves into a vision that's beyond their context, um, I deeply believe that you'll never be able to overcome those people. Um,
Yeah.
and I see the great example of that are in the struggle songs of many different movements. Particularly, I see them and feel them intuitively in the spirit that's around spirituals and what energy that they carry with them, and which really is an energy of I don't know if I will make it to the horizon, but I'm going to do everything I damn well can to get closer to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe somebody will be able to follow my footsteps and go a little bit further. Um, art extends us. It gives us possibility to do that. And yeah, yeah.
I think this is why art and social movements have always worked so powerfully together, is because both are vehicles for expanding and making manifest our visions and our dreams for greater justice, greater equality, greater expression, greater freedom, greater respect, greater community, greater integration and interconnection. And that, to me, I am a fan of big epic stories. I mean, I love epics and mythic adventures, but the problem with so many of them now for us is that they're actually quite outdated,
Yeah.
right? Particularly if you're coming out of the European canon, which is very common in our societies to reinforce that particular set of
Mm-hmm.
narratives. Odysseus, the Iliad, the Greek and Roman gods, the those are the fairy tales. Those are the ones that we keep telling over and over and over again. But if you look at them, even though they're very fun to read, we love adventure humans, we're totally into it. If you really look at them, they're often reinforcing this idea of might makes right, solitary heroes,
Mm-hmm.
that somebody's going to be rescued rather than liberating themselves, which is actually closer to the reality most of us who are oppressed or restricted in our societies actually experience.
Mm-hmm.
They often valorize war and violence because that was part of their purpose in the times and era of conquest and colonization. And we are actually emerging from that era. And I think we should really always remember that and ask ourselves, why are we putting the primacy of war and violence into these stories? And should we be doing that? And what happens when we don't? What happens when we take the things like nonviolence or peace building and take them seriously as the statistics on their efficacy deserve us to take them? And so that's something I do a lot in my work is like, for instance, in my series for young people, taking the genre of fantasy and some of the very common tropes, right? You know, we've added girls to the usual boy narratives, but you know, plucky young
Mm-hmm.
orphan makes good, changes world. That's pretty common, right? But instead of saying they change the world by grabbing a sword and winning a war, saying they change the world by grabbing these tools that are coming out of movements from around the world, and instead of winning a war, they stop a war and resolve that conflict differently. That might be heroism in our times.
Mm. Yeah. They win by gaining wisdom,
Yeah.
by being able to think outside the box, by being able to reclaim who they really are. Um, Beautiful human beings with a conscience, not people who advocate for domination and exploitation. You know, and I want to go back a little bit to your point about adventure, because what's interesting about that is in my first episode on this series, I spoke with Matthew Fox, who's a very well-known theologian and author and social critic, and this came up too. This idea of adventure came up in our conversation. Um, and, you know, I think it's a good word because, and I think your point is really the extension of what he mentioned, because he said, you know, this isn't an adventurous time. It's an exciting time. And I agree. I do think this is an exciting time and an adventurous time. But I think part of that that's missing, the next part to that, is we don't have rituals or rites of passage that help to take those narratives that we need, like you're showing in your books, of we don't win through war and violence, we win through cultivating wisdom and systems of caring. Um, and historically, the way we used to do that was through rites of passage. Um, and many different cultures have developed systems and rituals for rites of passage of all kinds. But I think in our general mainstream consciousness, we never really have had rites of passage that cultivate this type of virtuous living, because all of our rites of passage have been related to war and domination and violence. I mean, our
Yeah,
national
or
holidays.
consumerism as well. That's a big part of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you speak a little bit to that, and how do you feel that your novels could be used as a way of helping to cultivate such rites of passages?
That's an interesting question. I do think that when we read stories or when we watch movies, we ourselves, this is the whole point of stories for 40,000 to 2 million years of human existence in one species form or another. You know, we've been telling these stories as a ritual. A story is a ritual, right? We live into those characters. We live through those experiences in a vicarious way. We think about the people we see as role models in that story. We think about the people we see as villains in that story. We make choices in our lives about which one we're going to be more or less like, and what to do if we find ourselves as the villain, right? What to do if we find ourselves as the wounded healer or the fallible hero. How do we pick ourselves up again if we're in the depths of despair, right? How do we make wrong our rights if we've done a wrong? These are are thematic things that we learn through, predominantly through story. And we learn them both through fictional stories and through what we call non-fictional stories, or the news that we see on the television. And oftentimes what we learn in our culture is not very helpful for change. It's all punitive. If you do a wrong, you're a bad person, you're going to be punished forever for it, right? Which, if you think about our ancient myths, actually is very familiar to Roman and Greek archetypes, and very not familiar to other kinds of stories from around the world, right? And this is why we need to question what stories we're telling. But I would say, you know, when you, just to come back to the other aspect of rites of passage, and think a little bit about consumerism and the story that we're telling about who we should be in the world. In the US, there is a sub-narrative that says the point of our lives is to get educated, to work a job, to buy things, and then you die. That is literally the arc of expectation in our society for who we're going to be. And it's completely dysfunctional for our times. We live in times of immense and enormous change, when the possibilities have never been so great, for better or for worse. These are times akin to or larger than the moment that Frodo and Sam encounter when they step out the door of the Shire, right? But the story we're telling ourselves about ourselves is not that we're Frodo and Sam in the company of the Lord of the Rings, but that we're little hobbits going to live our whole lives out in that Shire. You see how
Yeah.
dysfunctional this is? So
Mm-hmm.
we need to step up to the times. We need to start telling the story like, this is an adventurous times. These are the most epic, existentially threatening times we have ever seen. We have more ways to end the species of humanity than we have ever had before, and we have a shorter timeline to resolve them than we have ever had before. And
Mm-hmm.
so we need to start telling the stories of who ourselves and who we are and the expectations of our lives in a way that is commensurate with the challenges and opportunities that we face. And personally, when I say I could either be Frodo and Sam in the adventure of the Company of the Ring, the Fellowship of the Ring, or I could be like a 1950s housewife, I'm like, why would I ever do the 1950s housewife thing? That's totally
Yeah.
boring. Why? Give me the adventure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I really appreciate the consumerism element, because I think it brings up the deeper question of that we have successfully been sold a narrative that says, as you just elucidated very well, that, you know, this is your job. You know, you're born, you go to school, you get an education, you try to get a great job that makes, you know, a six-figure salary if you can. You get married, you have kids, and you go to work from 9 to 5, and then you die, you know. And hopefully somewhere in between there, you'll have a nice retirement where you can be a parasite for a few years off of everybody else. You know, and I really do think that that is a narrative we have been sold really well, and we need to let it go, because it's not pro-human. It turns us into objects. It doesn't remind us who we really are, which is ultimate. You know, for me as a Christian, I would say that who we really are beloved children of God, and that gives us an authority to claim our self-worth, that we deserve to be treated well, and not just, you know, people are nice to us and say good things about us, but policies are created that reinforce who we are. And that, we should not have to live in a society, if we really know who we are, where we have to beg for healthcare. You know, we have to beg for a good job that doesn't compromise our health. You know, we don't have to live in areas like, for instance, I live in Houston, and on the east end of Houston, which is one of what we call what people in what are they called? What's that field of study? I don't remember. But
Sociology?
sociology. There you go.
Yeah.
What they call sacrifice zones.
Oh. Mm.
Easton is a sacrifice zone, and that's a very ominous and very intentionally racist categorization, because Easton, like several other parts of Houston, were the historic plantation areas. Um, And to this day, they still are neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and brown. They're also the most polluted parts of the city. If you live in the East End, your rate of getting cancer is way higher than anywhere else in the city, partly because the soil is polluted. So you can't grow any food. And if you grow food and you eat it, you have a very high risk of getting cancer or getting some other type of sickness. Um, the mosquitoes have now carry something in them because of all the pollution. And when you bite them, people get even more sick because of it. Um, and so if we really had a society that was grounded in this truth, that all of us are by our very dignity deserving of justice, we would have policies that would not allow that to happen. We would have elected leaders who did these things. We would have faith leaders who preached about this injustice and this sinful behavior out of their pulpit, not who people go to bed with or who they marry or how they have sex or whatever. Like, you know, it completely takes the narrative and flips it upside down and questions what our priorities are. And I think that has to happen. And I think that's part of what it means to practice justice in our world, to be artisans of the horizon, is to call out those narratives, flip them upside down, and maybe even replace them with new narratives, new archetypes, new adventures. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we underestimate how driven by story human beings are. The fact-based and science-based worldview emerged in revolt to the dominance, particularly of Christian dominance. In the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And it played a role, and it was very important. But in the secularization of our world, we have to remember that human beings are not just fact-driven. We are still very much story-driven, and our stories can be constructive, they can be beneficial, or they can be destructive and harmful. And when you recognize the stories that are driving people, sometimes you can see why they have that destructive story, what benefit comes to them from it. And our society certainly has lots of examples of this. It's very beneficial to some very powerful elite groups in our country to have us think of ourselves as nothing more than worker bees and consumers. It really helps them if we don't break out of that character mindset, if we don't demand that our world recognize that we are creative, resplendent, bold, brave, unexpected, wild, exuberant, brilliant creatures that have refused always and forever to go along with this reduction of the human nature into the little boxes that we've been prescribed to. And so I think when you recognize who benefits from a story, you start to understand why it's important to boldly tell a different story. And not just for yourselves, but to also maybe invite the other person, the person you might be in conflict with, or the persons, to consider whether or not that story might actually work better for them too. That's a big question to ask, but it may be possible that this new story, that in some ways is the very old story, is something that many of us are longing for, regardless of what end of a conflict we find ourselves on, whether we're the hero of our story and the villain of another, or vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's a great addition to all of this. And I mean, if I could cast a vision of what our world would look like beyond the horizon, I do think it'll be more story driven. I think the art of storytelling will become and will be a form of resistance, and it already is, but it'll continue onward, and our culture will be more story based and more really focused on what is it that we are saying about ourselves. You know, I often say it's not what people call you that matters, it's what you respond to or what you answer to. So people can call you the worst thing in the world, but if you don't answer to that and you answer to your actual name, you maintain your dignity and you maintain your power in that situation. Um, I mean, it's really frustrating when somebody tries to demean you by calling you a name and you don't respond to it. You know, it's frustrating to them because they immediately want that instant grab on you, you know. But part of telling your own story and knowing your own self-worth is knowing uh, when you speak and when to listen, you know, and when to hold your story. Um, you know, something that I think I brought you to Houston a few years ago, and you did, you know, a training for us, and you also shared about your books and things like that. Have you had any experiences, you know, as you've done your book tours and everything, of seeing how your books in particular, but maybe other novels with the type of bent that you write, um, how they've influenced some of the communities that you've shown up to, and to the point to where people are starting to claim their own narratives and maybe express them.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, Dandelion Insurrection has been read fairly widely at this point. I'm happy to report people do recommend it to their friends all the time, and it has a little like cult classic life of its own at this point. And it shows up in places that surprise me and delight me. I'm so honored at the people who have read this book at Standing Rock or read it when they were locked down outside of the FERC office to stop pipeline permits, or read it in a tree sit while they're blockading a gas pipeline construction. To me, when people do these things, I am humbled to the point of tears to be part of that movement in that way, to be keeping people company, accompanying them on this journey that of changing our stories from this worker consumer mentality to the heroics and the courage and the sacrifice that we engage in when we do action on behalf of humanity and the planet. That to me is I don't need a Nobel Prize. I don't need any big literature prize. I've already received it from the frontline activists who are reading these books. That is a profound honor, and I try to live up to that honor every single day and challenging my own envelopes, my own biases, my own lack of perceptions, the boxes that I was trained to live in, and that manifests even in what I dream is possible. Right? That's one reason I shared this book, is because this book is teaching me to dream bigger, to dream bolder, to think outside the lines of the things that I've been perceiving. And that to me is, we learn from each other. I've been saying for many years since Dandelion Insurrection came out, you know, people say this is a one of a kind book. It's a genre unto itself. And I always say, I hope not. I hope that there are dozens of writers like me out there doing this incredible work. I hope that I am part of an emerging genre that we're about to discover in our world. I hope that other people dream of writing these books that show the beauty of resistance and resilience in our world today, both in realistic fiction and in speculative fiction or in sci-fi. Nnedi Okorafor and N.K. Jemisin do amazing work in this regard, and there are so many others I could name. And I really think that together, along with movements, this is how we all start to change the stories that we're telling. And that it's not me that's doing this, certainly not by myself, but that I get to be a part of the movement in this way is such a profound honor.
I think that's just so cool. The Dandelion Insurrection and probably Billionaire Buddha are my favorite out of the books that you've written. And I helped with both of those books. I contributed some of the money to help get them put together. And that was an honor. And Actually, I have 2 copies of the Dandelion Insurrection somewhere. Oh, it's right there in my bookshelf. You can't see it, I don't think. But I have 2 of them, and one of them has my name in it, which is so cool. Yeah, you're influencing the consciousness, and that's so cool. And one of the things you said earlier that was interesting, because I don't think we realize it very consciously. In your narrative about either we can be Frodo, and all of them in the company of the ring, or the Lord of the Rings, or we can be the little hobbits, the smaller characters. I think we tend to want to be the smaller, more minor characters because we've been indoctrinated so well into not thinking highly of ourselves. And creative adventures and stories and rites of passage and art in general really help to reframe that and to think highly of ourselves and to know that we are capable of being the one that goes on the great adventure and discovers wisdom and beautiful realities. But also, I think what's interesting about it for me and some of the work that I do is I try to really actively shatter and repiece or re-put together this these ideas around religion and spirituality that make us feel like we need to have a savior, I guess, to put it, plainly. In Christian theology, we're always told that, we were we were wretched people until God's grace came involved, despite our nose, and we suddenly were able to be saved, and now we have the opportunity to be in heaven. Well, frankly, I don't really buy into that whole silly concept. And also, why would we want to have a God that thinks that? Why would we want to believe in a God who thinks that we are worthless unless we pledge allegiance? That's the same type of God that's an abusive God, and we need to challenge that construct. And so I try to do that by helping to reframe stories and reframe. I mean, all of it's a myth. We don't really know. We don't really have any proof of any of it, And I don't think that's bad. I think myths are important. I certainly am on the same team as Joseph Campbell that myths need to be created because that's how we create culture, which are really just stories, And so I know you're not a Christian, but I bring that into the equation because I do think that religion has a part in this consumerism culture, in this culture that objectifies us and promotes violence. And we have to, I don't think we need to get rid of religion or spirituality, but we certainly need to reshape it and revolutionize it and get back to the roots, which are storytelling, common ritual, community gathering, and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things about Christianity that is very interesting is that the origin of Christianity is the questioning of an old story, radical questioning of it. And Jesus's life, if you look at it in what we know of it, he was a radical questioner. He said, what do you mean women can't sit with me as a disciple? What do you mean that these so-called prostitutes, and we could argue about that, are unworthy of my devotion and my attention? What do you mean that this man of another tribe is not worthy of being alongside with me? What do you mean that this person is unworthy of redemption? That the poor should not be treated with equal respect than the rich, or that the rich should not be called out with equal force for their cruelties. That Jesus's life is one of radically questioning the stories that he inherited, and to me, it's one of the things that endears him to me. Although I sometimes don't feel that same endearment to people who now have codified certain stories and use them
Mm-hmm.
to control other people. I think if we find our religions doing that, we need to start questioning that story and why it came about. And we could do a deep analysis on Christianity and how the stories of Jesus's radical, non-hierarchical organization with his disciples became the hierarchy of the church. And
Mm-hmm.
why that story? What has it created in the world? Who has it benefited and who has it not? And if it's not benefiting you, you might want to be the first to question that story, that narrative. So I love doing this questioning. I think the Buddhists as well have deep questions to ask themselves about the ways that they treat men and women in their faith. The Hindus have had
Mm-hmm.
to radically grapple with their caste system.
Mm-hmm.
We could go down the list of every religion in the world and talk about the relearning of story that we're going to
Mm-hmm.
have to do. And
Yeah.
it's part of the work of our world. It always has been, and it's even more imperative now as we find ourselves a burgeoning population of over 7 billion people living in closer and closer proximity to people who do not look like us, who do not believe the same things as us. But in such a
Mm-hmm.
world, it doesn't work to be intolerant. It doesn't work to
Yeah.
treat people who are different with violence and oppression. It only begets more violence and oppression that comes back 10,000 fold upon those who wield it in the first place. And we
Yeah.
must all be the first to break those cycles.
Yeah. That's so good. I love it. Love it. Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I really do think that one of the ongoing realities about some of our stories is that we get so into our narrative that we begin to confuse our narrative with reality. And one of the things that really is manifesting is that we have to be very clear about what is right in front of us, even if what is right in front of us differs from the narrative that we've constructed. Um, and how is what is right in front of us, how does that force us to have to reframe our narrative or construction? And that having to do that is not bad. And also, confronting the idea that our story is over. Um, I really love that the UCC, the United Church of Christ, has as its official motto, God is still speaking, because I think that's great. I think our cosmic story is still speaking. It's still being unfolded. New characters are coming into play. New archetypes are being born. Now we're really having to be forced into understanding of the archetype of the radical, the rebel, the one who pushes the envelope. And we're having to deal with the archetype of being uncomfortable. Really to this point now, we're not being allowed, even the universe has got into this, of not allowing human beings to be comfortable with violence. We're being forced to be uncomfortable by it. And we're also learning new ways to be intimate with each other and what it means to be human. And I also think we're being forced to accept the fact that this is an apocalyptic time. That word apocalypse really literally means to reveal, to take the veil and to pull it apart. I mean, the last book of the Christian Bible is Revelation. The original Greek word of the title Revelation is apocalypse. And so it's translated into English as revelation, which just means to pull the veil apart. And now we're being told, okay, it's time to pull apart the veil of racism and white supremacy. Time to pull the veil apart of patriarchy. And what is it that we're going to find beyond that veil? And is it going to be justice, compassion, having a high regard for human beings and for creation and other animals? What do other sentient beings have to say about our narrative? And are we willing to listen to them? So anyway, we're coming to our end now, and I want you to take the last 10 minutes of this beautiful exchange that we've been having and share what's on your mind. What do you feel that you're really being drawn to, and how are you feeling called to move about this world as we continue to unfold our narrative?
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. Thanks for this profound and important conversation. I could have this conversation all day, every day with everyone. I think this very thing we're doing of talking about the stories we've been giving and the stories we want to be telling, and the gap between those two, is some of the most critically important work for us to be doing. I mean, the next time you want to go watch a Marvel comic movie, consider maybe you should sit down and tell yourself a story instead. That maybe those prophets of Hollywood are off the mark in what they're telling us over and over again. And that maybe your friends and neighbors, if invited to the conversation, have a much more compelling story that they're yearning to tell. I am intrigued by the idea that the story that's coming, in a positive sense, post-apocalypse, post-breakdown, and maybe the breakdown becomes a breakthrough if we get our acts together, because the possibility of that is in our hands. If we do nothing,
Yeah.
the breakdown becomes the end of the story. But if we step up now, the breakdown becomes a possibility of a breakthrough, and there are no guarantees at this point in our story. There's no guarantees. But I am intrigued by the era that comes after. I am intrigued by this idea that we may have a chance to enter into a profound era of healing, where actually healing is the predominant direction of the next 500 years. That if harm and domination and exploitation and colonization and conquest and racism and sexism and classism was some of the predominant factors of the previous 500 centuries, that healing might be the primary goal of entire societies for 500 plus years. That is an era I am intrigued by. I don't know all the answers to that story. I don't know what that's all going to look like, but I'm seeing glimmers of it. Things like restorative justice on the rise. I'm seeing things like young people who want to study the repair of ecosystems or how mycelium can break down toxins. That these are their burning interests in a world on fire is incredible to me. That gives me hope. I'm seeing things like participatory democracy structures being introduced in the midst of movements to challenge structures of government that have become unresponsive and irresponsible to their people and the planet. I am intrigued by what it would feel like to live in an entire society that no longer sees itself as separate from the earth, that no longer sees the earth as an object to exploit or walk upon, but rather as a living being that we live in relationship to. I want to live in that time. And I'm willing to do the work now to help see if we can get there in my lifetime, in your lifetime. These are the stories that fascinate me, because I feel like if we're talking about the horizon, they're not actually as far away as we might think. It's not going to take us 500 years to get to those ideas. They're already here in seeds right now in the present. And the question is, are we going to tend and nurture those seeds to see more of that in our world? I always say for every problem that we're confronting, the saving grace of these times is that we have an example of a tangible, practical, proven solution. We have spent the past 40 years developing those solutions in every aspect of our society. Having those solutions be brought forth from original traditions like restorative justice is a great example, which has indigenous roots. And the real question of the next couple decades, to me, is really what happens when we institute and implement and expand those systems? What kind of catalytic positive transformation occurs when we stop even one piece of the harm that's happening and implement a healing process in its stead? And to me, these are the conversations, these are the ideas that we're not actually spending quite enough time talking about, recognizing, seeing, uplifting, celebrating, because the world is on fire, because our house and your house and the next house on the block are on fire. But we're forgetting that behind us across the street, this amazing community garden has been collecting water and making sure that the next block is not going to burn. So that's the things that intrigue me, that our other world is not only possible, it is actually here. So what are we going to do to help it spread, to help it grow, to help go to the people who have never seen these things before, that are so outside of their worldview, that they are astounded when we say the words defund the police because they can't imagine another way. When here we are sitting here being like, we've seen this other way, and man, is it amazing. And why haven't we been doing this for 100 years or so, right? I am excited about living in these times because unlike the 1950s, unlike the hobbits in the Shire prior to the Fellowship of the Ring, we get a chance to go on these adventures. We get a chance to walk out the door and get on that road and not know where it's going to take us, but be willing to live in that scale and proportion of epic heroicness that is not the solo lonely hero, but is actually the collection of all of us together. And that makes me very excited to be alive right now.
Oh my gosh, that was beautiful. Yes, amen. I agree 100%. I do, you know, I really do resonate with everything, and I feel excited about it as well. And I'm always excited about the idea of giving birth to this new normal, and knowing the fact that it's here. It's already, you know, it's now. We just have to be committed to the now, you know, to this present moment. Be available to this experience. Doesn't mean you have to be qualified. Doesn't mean you have to have all these titles and degrees and you know, you went to this college or that college. It just means you need to be available and bring all that you are and all of your fallacies and all of your brokenness and all of your beautifulness, and just be available. And to me, that's what it means to practice nonviolence. That's what it means to be a practitioner of intentional non-harming. To, as your banner in the background says, to be kind, to be connected, to be unafraid. You know, to be like that dandelion who grows where it's not supposed to grow, or where we say it's not supposed to grow. You know, to really be harbingers of radical defiance that pushes towards wellness and love and just uh, awesomeness. Well, we only have a few minutes left. I want you to take those last few minutes and tell people, where can they find you? How can they connect with you? Are you teaching anything that they can sign up for? All the things.
Yeah, so people can find out about my work and my books and any upcoming events or online talks or workshops at www.riverasun.com. That's RIVERASUN, like the sun overhead.com. And yeah, all of my books are on all the usual places you would look for books. So you can find them. I always encourage people to order them from my website because I do send you nice notes, personal notes with them. And I am not a giant corporation, so I do appreciate connecting human to human in a time when we're trying to transform that aspect of our world as well. So thank you. And just a big shout out to you, Jerry, for opening these conversations, for not making it one conversation with one person, but conversations with many people, and to have the complexity and the beauty of the many stories be the story. That it is not one story, just as it's not a movement, but it is a movement of movements, emphasis on the plural. This is a story of stories, emphasis on the plural. That the beauty of it is that none of us have all the answers, but all of us together have the answers.
Yeah. Amen. Absolutely. Well, it was good to have you, and we're going to have you come back because there's just so much more that I want to talk about. And we have to bring in some other folks too. But well, I
Yeah.
will let you go, and you know, be bold and be courageous. Be of good spirits. Always know that you are made to be great and wise and to be awesome, and nobody can ever take that away from you.
Likewise.